Inside modern air defense response systems, the most dangerous failure does not begin when the radar goes blind. It does not begin when the launch battery stays silent. It does not begin when the command layer disappears. It begins when the structure still sees the threat, still tracks the threat, and still prepares to respond. But the sequence has already moved too far for that response to preserve the intercept. That is the break. Because air defense response systems are built on one condition above all others. They do not merely need to identify danger. They need to arrive inside it early enough to still control the result. And that window is narrower than it appears. A threat is detected. Its track is stable. The defended sector is known. Nothing about the opening picture suggests collapse. The architecture is operating. Data is moving. Readiness is live. Assignment is possible. From the outside, this still looks like a structure doing exactly what it was built to do. But air defense does not survive on activity alone. It survives on timing. The moment the incoming sequence moves far enough forward, every valid action inside the structure begins losing value at the same time. Not because those actions are false, because they are late. That is what makes this failure dangerous. The system is not absent from the event. It is present all the way through it. It is watching, updating, calculating, preparing an answer. But the threat is already approaching the point where response no longer governs the outcome. And once that happens, the architecture is still active inside a fight it is no longer shaping. That is where loss of control begins. Not at the point of silence. At the point where the response remains real, but no longer arrives early enough to matter in the way the structure requires. Air defense response systems are designed to compress time. Detection hands to tracking. Tracking hands to evaluation. Evaluation hands to assignment. Assignment hands to engagement. Each layer exists to reduce delay before the incoming sequence closes the intercept window. That is the promise. Not that the system will react eventually, that it will react soon enough. So when response starts falling behind, the danger is not always visible in the surface picture. The screens remain full. The tracks remain current. The operators still have a recognized threat. Command still appears to hold the structure together. Even the defensive logic may still be unfolding in the correct order. That is why this kind of failure is so easy to miss until the sequence is already unstable. The architecture keeps producing signs of competence. It continues to generate readiness. It continues to produce options. It continues to move toward response. But each step now occurs on timing that is no longer aligned with the threat it is meant to defeat. The system is not frozen. It is behind. And once a live air defense structure falls behind an incoming sequence, the pressure compounds fast. Every review consumes seconds the threat is also consuming. Every handoff narrows the intercept geometry. Every retained layer of formal control reduces the amount of time left for actual control. That is the reversal at the center of this failure. The structure still looks disciplined precisely while its usable timing is collapsing. No single layer has to fail dramatically for the sequence to become dangerous. Detection can be clean, tracking can be accurate, the response unit can be ready, the assignment can be legitimate. And still, the defense position degrades. Because air defense is not secured by being correct in principle. It is secured by entering the engagement before the threat crosses the point where correctness arrives without leverage. That is the threshold the structure must never miss. And yet this is exactly the threshold that can disappear while the system still appears intact. The incoming threat closes distance. The defended zone becomes immediate. Response authority is still present. Engagement logic is still active. But the structure is now working with shrinking geometry, shrinking margin, and shrinking control over the result. The system has not stopped functioning. It has entered a race it is no longer winning. Then the response finally commits. The intercept is assigned. The engagement path is activated. a defensive action enters the sequence. This is the moment that usually carries reassurance. Because once the air defense response system moves from preparation into action, the structure appears to have restored control. The defense is live. The answer is in motion. The architecture has responded. But that appearance can be false. Because action is not the same as recovery. A response launched after the decisive timing window does not reverse the sequence just because the structure can still point to movement. It only proves the system remained active long enough to act inside a problem it no longer controls. That is the hard truth in this failure type. The intercept can be real and still be too late. The defensive battery can fire and still be entering behind the threat. The command layer can still issue valid direction and still fail to protect the defense outcome. At that point, the architecture is no longer using response to govern the event. It is using response to chase it. And chasing is not control. Because once the incoming sequence has advanced past the point where interception can still reliably shape the result, the structure is no longer deciding the event on favorable terms. It is reacting inside terms the threat has already imposed. That changes the meaning of every action downstream. The launch still happens. The tracking still updates. The response path still closes. But the sequence those actions enter has already hardened. The defense is now operating with reduced geometry, reduced authority over timing, and reduced power over the intercept. This is why late response in air defense is not just a timing error. It is a state change. The architecture crosses from active protection into active pursuit, without always recognizing the exact moment the shift occurred. From the operator position, this can still feel like a live attempt to restore the structure. From the system position, the break is already deeper than that. Because the incoming threat is no longer being met at the distance where the defense establishes control. It is being met after the structure has surrendered that advantage. Once that happens, response continues. But it continues from behind. This is the point where the system becomes dangerous to itself. Not because it stops reacting, because it keeps reacting after control has already thinned out. The structure still produces commands, still distributes force, still moves defensive action toward the threat. But those actions are now taking place inside a sequence whose decisive timing no longer belongs to the defense. That is the consequence. The response remains visible. The control does not. And when those two separate air defense begins performing order after the moment order could still protect the result. That is how the defense outcome breaks. Not through total inactivity. Through active response arriving after the intercept has already lost its favorable conditions. The system keeps working. The threat keeps advancing. The margin keeps disappearing. The engagement remains real, but the leverage inside it is gone. That is why this failure is more severe than simple delay. Delay suggests a slower version of the same structure. This is not that. This is a structure whose relationship to the event has changed. It is still organized around interception, but no longer positioned to secure it. It is still issuing response, but no longer early enough to govern the impact window. It is still formally in command, but no longer in command of the sequence that matters most. And once air defense reaches that state, the remaining actions cannot be judged by whether they occurred. They have to be judged by what they arrived in time to change. That answer is what exposes the break. Because a response system that enters behind the incoming threat does not preserve the defended space in the same way, even when the engagement remains disciplined. It begins absorbing the loss of timing across every layer at once. Across the battery, across the command node, across the defended asset, across the sequence itself. The architecture continues to act, but it acts without the timing advantage that gave those actions meaning. That is the authority break. The structure is still there. The response is still there. But control has already moved elsewhere. That is the doctrine at the center of modern air defense response systems. Their strength does not come from seeing the threat. It does not come from being capable of response. It comes from preserving enough timing margin for response to arrive before the threat sequence decides the result on its own. That is what must be protected. Because once response begins entering after that margin is gone, the structure has already shifted into a weaker condition. Even if every display still shows activity and every layer still appears committed. Air defense does not fail only when the system cannot act. It also fails when action arrives after timely interception has already been surrendered. That distinction matters, because it explains why a functioning response architecture can still lose control without ever looking inactive. The decisive question is never just whether the system responded. It is whether the response entered early enough to preserve the intercept, the defended space, and the defense outcome. If the answer is no, then the structure is no longer governing the event. It is reacting behind it. And once a response system lives behind the threat it was built to stop, its remaining order does not restore control. It only organizes the consequences of losing it. Air defense response systems do not lose control when response disappears. They lose it when response arrives after the threat has already taken the sequence away.